Hello, friends. It's 10 a.m. in Redmond. It's not Tuesday, but close enough, by which I mean it's a day that ends in Y. And in order for that joke to work, I needed to do English, which I almost never do. So consider the show introduced in English. And yes, I called it a show. Right. So we have several red things. Um, the first one we have to go on a miss because no one's here to talk about it, so we will move on to the second of the red things. And as usual with starting a thing, I need to make the browser bigger. So, implementations of marshallers using custom type marshaller attribute 66623. Eleanor, Jeremy.
So this is our proposal to actually add implementations that use the custom type marshaller attributes that we got approved a couple weeks ago. So we focused on strings and arrays because those are common things that people would need, and we are generally sensitive to like security issues and such. So we want them in the actual runtime. Um, at the API surface, they basically just follow the shapes that we got approved with the custom type marshaller attribute. So I don't, hopefully nothing surprising there. Um,
Which namespace will this all go in? Supposedly all
oh,
system runtime
wow,
interrupt
I missed that.
services?
Yeah, system runtime interrupt services. We discussed whether we wanted like a separate one for generated marshalling. Right now, we just have it under system interrupt services, runtime interrupt services.
And so those are attributes that we ship that are then used by the generated code. They're not generated attributes, right?
The the custom type marshaller attribute.
Yeah. So the attributes themselves are not generated, right? They are literally
Yeah,
shipped with
they're
the
in the
framework.
runtime. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. That's always the trick when people review APIs for source generation to figure out which is the part that's generated versus which is the thing that we need to ship for the generated code to be used.
Yeah, everything here is like it should be. It's in the runtime. It's not generated by the source generator.
Okay. Is there anything? I assume UTF-16 marshaller is UTF-16 native Indian.
Yeah,
Yes.
it's machine.
Okay. So not guaranteeing little or big. It's whatever the
Yeah.
machine wants to be. Um, yeah. So is there anything special in any of the bodies, or are we really just looking at the names of the types?
Should just be the names. The bodies are very much just follow the shape that we have approved. There's nothing we added.
Yeah, it's basically the names and the namespace, whether
Yeah.
we want to do in a system runtime interop services or a sub namespace.
Okay. Since no one else is talking, I feel that there was something weird that we didn't like with the name of ANSI in our string marshalling.
The way we treat ANSI is weird because it's really only a thing on Windows, but historically we've always been ANSI means actually ANSI on Windows and then UTF-8 on non-Windows. This basically continues to do that, so it matches our other public APIs where it's like Marshall string as ANSI means ANSI on Windows and non-ANSI on UTF-8 or on
Yeah.
non-Windows.
But I mean, I guess it's consistent. It's do what the current marshal ANSI says. But okay. Uh, UTF-8's obvious. UTF-16's obvious. When we, since I can't even tell if Levi's with us. For the UTF-8 string marshaller, and even I guess our current marshalling behavior, if the native buffer is garbage, like the UTF-8 is invalid, such as the last byte says there are 2 bytes remaining. Uh, do we Like, are we doing conformant UTF-8 interpreting, or are we doing lax UTF-8 interpreting? So is the marshaller going to just say, fine, here's some garbage? Or is it going to throw?
We are doing whatever the default UTF-8 encoding does. I am not 100% sure what that is.
I feel like it's lax because
It's
reasons. But again, I guess the other is that consistent with what we're doing in UTF-8 marshalling in ANSI mode on Linux right now.
yeah, so we're basically using the same APIs as the built-in system uses for UTF-8 right now. Would be the idea, which is just use system text encoding UTF-8.
Okay. UTF-16 was machine Indian, so we don't need to talk about the Indian. What's a pitter array marshaller?
This is for an array of pointers because we can't have pointers in the generics.
Aside from the type int pitter, do we use PTR anywhere? It feels like we should just expand the and call it pointer array marshaller.
I guess like so the Marshall APIs will say like structure to pitter or pointer to whatever. But in those cases, they are referring to int pointer as the actual type that they're taking.
I think we do have some things in unsafe that spell out pointer fully. I think the newer APIs are doing kind of what Jeremy's saying, which is
Yeah.
I think it's the old Marshall APIs that are still using PTR.
I think we have unmanaged function pointer attribute, for example. So that was, I think, a more recent one.
And we spelled out pointer.
Yeah, we spelled it out.
All right, so changing PTR to pointer.
I mean, one thing that might be worthwhile considering is actually doing a subnamespace. I mean, that should probably be a separate API proposal, I guess, but I don't know how you want to do this, but the interrupt service namespace is fairly busy and there is a lot of legacy in it. So it might be worthwhile just thinking about if you want people to write these modern signatures with these modern attributes for source generation, that it might be worthwhile thinking about what a separate namespace might look like and if it actually helps. If people always end up with having to have a using for both namespaces, then it might not help that much in IntelliSense, but it might help a decent deal in docs if people can just open up the subnamespace and see what attributes are in there. Because I suspect that there's not really a great grouping mechanism based on the naming you have here, which is basically all, common suffix based, which is what we normally do, and that usually results in types being fairly far apart, right? ANSI and UTF-8, for example, is pretty much on opposite ends of the list, right? So the question is basically how would people discover the related types, right? Normally base types would work, but in your case there isn't really a base type because they're all structs. So just from that point of view, it might be worthwhile thinking about that.
So are you suggesting instead of system runtime interrupt services, it goes system runtime interrupt services dot marshallers?
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. I don't know necessarily that that's the right approach. I was just thinking basically the features that we have, logically that we would have to use here, it might be worthwhile to establish some sort of grouping mechanism. And maybe the right answer is we put all the marshallers in one namespace. So that's because that's the only way we can group them, right? Because base types don't really work.
I think that does make sense to me. We had discussed that, but I don't think we ended up with like a strong preference either way.
Emo, could you also add some insight into the, if you recall the Objective-C change interrupt we had?
Mm-hmm.
There was originally we there was discussion of putting it in an Objective C sub namespace, and we got a lot of pushback on that in the API review. So, can you elaborate on why this one is different than that?
I mean, it's all degrees, right? I would say in general, like you want namespaces when you have sufficient meat. You don't want namespaces for one or two types usually. So that's the other thing, right? If you end up with having just 3 marshals, then I think a sub namespace is clearly over-engineered. If you think you end up with like a dozen or 2 dozens over time, then it might be worthwhile to have that in that sub namespace, right? It's really more about from a user standpoint, like, normally namespaces help with organizational stuff to, discover related functionality. And, very often in the BCL, when you look at interfaces or abstract base types, normally the way docs work, if you see the doc page for the base type, the docs will display the derived types, right? So that's why we normally have a naming convention where they have a common suffix. But the problem with suffixes is, of course, they don't help you with alphabetical sorting, right? So that means whatever the prefix ends up being, they might be arbitrarily far apart. But because we have a base type document that lists all the derived types, it's usually not the worst in the world. But in your case, they're all struct, so they're all just, kind of related by attribution, right? And or by convention rather, right? And so that makes it very difficult for people to discover, here all the kind of marshals that could pass in for this attribute, right? They would have to just, look at the names effectively and then click on them, right? But marshal is also not necessarily the thing that helps them that much, because we have a ton of stuff that has marshal in the name somewhere, right? So yeah,
users reference this type, or
they put
the
it
source
in
generated
right?
references it.
My understanding is they put it, like they reference it from using the, if you look at the thing at the very bottom where it says API usage, you see the method declaration for the p-invoke signature, and there you basically say marshal using type of and then the marshal, right?
And the library import attribute is already in runtime interrupt services.
Yes.
So another namespace would mean you'd have to do 2 names usings.
We could.
So
Sure.
Right? They
Oh.
already have interrupt services in order to do library import.
I mean, the library import one we haven't shipped yet, right? That's new for 7, so we could put this in the other namespace if you wanted to.
And we wouldn't call it marshalers though.
Well, exactly. So that's why I was thinking that maybe it's a separate API proposal to just think about what the grouping might look like, right? If we can introduce a new namespace that is more geared to this scenario, where we can put all the related things, including the library import attribute, then yeah, we should have a more generic name. If we can't do that because people have to use already other things from the interrupt services namespace, then it might make more sense to just have one for the marshals.
I mean, it's not most people's styles, but the way that usings actually function in C# is, if you just had a using for interrupt services, you can write marshalers dot, because it'll find that as a thing hanging off of one of your existing usings. And so only having one using import here gives you a very easy, well, what are the places that get to go here? It's all the things that autocomplete after marshalers dot. We could also be weird and just make a marshalers class and make all these be
nested types.
Yeah, nested types. That seems like we're doing things just for syntax in times that we don't usually like that because it has awkward syntax, but it's another option. It doesn't compose well with third parties. They can't put things in as a nested type in a type that we own, so a sub namespace is more forward-looking.
Yeah, my concern generally with nested types is it's not very intuitive, because if you just look at the docs and you see a type, you don't really expect the type to have nested types, so you wouldn't necessarily click on the type and see what's in there for other types, right? So it would generally just hide these types even further, I think, right? But it would certainly centralize them.
Yeah, not really suggesting that we would do it, but it is an option. So I think it'd be
Yeah,
fine
that's
as a
why I
sub
said, like, I
namespace
mean-
just for the marshaller types and not have the attribute in the same one. Like, I don't think that'd be terrible.
Yeah. I mean, it would be worthwhile to just think about whether we can put this new feature area entirely there or mostly in there, right?
Interrupt services too.
Yeah, pick a better name than that, but
EX.
you get the. Well, I was thinking like I don't know, source generation, or whatever you want to call this, or
System runtime marshalling.
I mean, as bad as that is, that might actually be not a terrible idea. Yeah. I guess my question is for the people that are working on the interrupt feature, like basically what experience do you want people that are new to this scenario, right? And if you can point them to one namespace that has, let's say, a few dozen types in there and they're all related, that is probably easier than pointing them at the interrupt namespaces that has 20 years worth of random goodness. But I think other than that, I think the shapes make sense based on what we discussed last time.
Yeah, I agree. So I put the notes. Oh, I guess I can show it from the browser instead of from here. My brain will wake up eventually. Right, so consider whether or not it's valuable to put the new marshallers in a sub namespace of interrupt services, or if we also want to move the new library import attribute, then something like system runtime marshalling for we've rewritten marshalling completely, here's where it lives now. But if you don't think it's valuable, then I think they go in system runtime interrupt services as approved, and then if you do want to move them, then that would just be another proposal for moving new types, which is, while it's something we would document as a breaking change in a preview to preview release, it's it hasn't really shipped, so it doesn't really break anybody.
So what happens when somebody wants to marshal something that is a pointer of a pointer of a pointer? They just screwed. They have to, because we can't. So they can't use any of these types here, right? Because they're not genericizable, or the word ends up being.
Yeah,
They
we're
have to
kind of
define
limited, we're limited by the type system here. So what we can tell people is do a pointer to an int ptr, because you can do that. You can use that with pointer array marshaller, and I guess that's good enough. Or a void pointer you could use.
Can't they write their own?
Yeah,
Can't they write their own marshaller and then point to that in their attribute?
They could, but there's a lot of particular behavior with arrays. So basically they'd have to copy the entire surface area and forward everything, which would be annoying.
is void star and void star would count as an unmanaged type, right?
Yes, a void star would count as an unmanaged type.
Or so if you had an array of pointers to pointers to ints.
Void star you can't put in a generic because it's a pointer. So you'd have to do int ptr as the t.
Okay, so pointers can't be ever used as generics.
Yeah, otherwise we wouldn't need this. If there was some way to say we allow pointers and we will be held by the restrictions of pointers, things would still work fine.
There is a language proposal to add pointers and generics, but it's going to require a ton of effort to make that happen, and it's not a .NET 7 thing.
Right. Yeah, I was mostly interested in what would be the fallout be. Basically, you say there's two options. They can either define their own marshaller, which is work, or they basically just live with an array of int PTRs, and then they just have to do cast for the elements, which doesn't seem terrible.
Yeah, I mean, even if they wanted to write their own type, they could write their type in terms of this one using pointer array marshaller of int pitter, and then just do themselves the extra dereferencing on the way out. Like they won't have to
And
really
can
write actually complicated marshalling. Just
And can they
TRS.
cast an underlying array? Can I actually cast my array of, foo star to an array of in PTR? Is it actually legal? Or do I have to create a new array and copy?
So inside the implementation of pointer array marshaller, we reuse array marshaller by making it an array of int PTR using unsafe as and immediately throwing it into a span. So,
Gotcha. So they could do the same thing.
yeah.
Yeah, and arrays do magical things with types that are of similar sizes that are value types.
Yeah, that's not terrible. I mean, that's probably good enough. Presumably, people that do that know that they can do that.
All right. Anything else? Sold.
And you would just, so the community, the API would like us to come back for the namespace debate?
I mean, it would be nice if you would think about that, because I think it would make the feature easier to learn potentially. And you want people to adopt the feature, right? You want them to move away from the old style p invokes to the new style p invokes, right?
Right, absolutely agreed. Is this something that we could do over email, or would we like to come through this whole thing? Like, would like to come here again?
I mean, it kind of depends on what it looks like, but I suspect that we probably want a conversation. I don't think that we can. I don't think it's as easy as saying, oh yeah, we need this namespace and then put these types here. We probably have questions would be my guess, because these are I don't even know what it looks like, right? That's why I said it would be good if somebody would sit down and say, okay, here's the types that we end up needing. For example, library import attribute is another one, right? And then consider what that would look like. And then also look at actual code, right? Because if people always end up with using statements to both, it probably doesn't make a huge difference in IntelliSense, but it might still make a huge difference in terms of docs, right? Because they can click on the separate namespace, they see most of the new types correlated, and that might make it easier for them to understand, okay, what am I supposed to use here in conjunction? That's my biggest concern, right? If you point them in interrupt services today, there's a lot of stuff, right? It's not clear which one is related to which. You basically have to know. And in this case, the other reason why I think the namespace would be worthwhile considering is because the new thing you're building is effectively an alternative to the stuff that is already there. Some stuff is shared, but a lot of stuff is kind of, separate, right? So that's why it might be worthwhile having a separate namespace, just to make it clear what the separate stuff actually is.
Yeah, finding the marshaller variants in this sea of fun is probably hard.
At least they'll all be in struct instead of classes, which is a relatively smaller group in the documentation.
It does currently fit on one screen, but that won't be true after you're done.
Right. Yeah, that's my concern. Because of SourceGen, we generally add more flavors, right? That's kind of what I expect to happen here. We end up with 24 of those types, probably.
Okay, that sounds good. The interrupt team will loop back on this. Thanks for the clarification. We're good.
Cool.
Thanks for entertaining us.
System diagnostics activity, enumeration API iteration 2. That was a lot of words. Tarek.
Yeah. Okay, so yeah, we have activity class, which is including some properties. This property is returning I enumerable. And these properties are very critical for, performance critical for the OpenTelemetry. They are using it a lot. And they are trying to be performant as much as they can. So during last release .NET 6, so OpenTelemetry was working around some issues to make it more performant by just reflecting on the internal types that we have inside the system diagnostics namespace, just to avoid the memory allocation. Our implementation inside this, our internal implementation actually depends on the structs also. Read-only structs, most of it. And also there is some struct copying during the enumeration here. So this proposal has two benefits. First one is to stop OpenTelemetry depending on the internal type at all. So we can expose this type, which is we return from our enumeration. So they can use the public type instead of reflecting on the internal type, which is be risky to do that. Risky to reflect on the internal type. The second thing is this proposal, if you see inside the enumerator, we have the current property, and this current property is returning ref t instead of just t here. And this is mainly will helping with avoiding copying the struct during the enumeration. So if we expose this if you expose this, from system diagnostics, so OpenTelemetry can easily, using it and avoid the memory allocations and also avoid the struct copying in the same time. Yeah, so that's all. So the properties that we return from that, something like tags inside activity or links, which is return enumerable of activity links. Some properties like this. So all of these properties is going to return this type.
Derek, so I'm curious about the abstract on the outer class. I'm assuming that's because the intent is we'll have different concrete implementations of this depending on the thing that's actually being enumerated, whether it's links or tags or items or whatever. Is that right?
That's right. Yeah, exactly.
So that also then means that every call to move next on the enumerator is going to have to either know about all those types or be making a virtual call or something.
Yeah, actually we have done some prototype with this, and we found like the perf is good with current prototype, but you have a good point about to avoid just the virtual calling for movement.
Normally I would say it doesn't matter at all, but they were bending over backwards using reflection emit to access internals.
Yeah,
they care about overheads, so it seems like we're introducing something that has its own overhead. I just want us to be cautious of that.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, as I mentioned about like if the current proposal, performant enough, good enough for the OpenTelemetry, so we should be fine. But if it is not, so we have to tweak this proposal.
Ask a question about that, Steve. So can you explain again why the move next would be a virtual?
No, move next wouldn't be virtual, but it would presumably be. Move next is going to have, you have one struct that potentially has to deal with many different kinds of classes under the covers. So move next is going to have to do something to differentiate them, and that's either if this is activity link enumerable, else if this is activity tag enumerable, whatever, or there's going to be some virtual method that it's calling into or something that it's switching over. Basically, you've got one entry point and potentially n concrete implementations that have to be chosen between, right?
Eric, if you want, pop open, I don't know who's showing, there's at the bottom of the screen that there's kind of an implementation. So just by chance of how it works in the code right now, all of those structs are fed the same thing. There's this internal linked list, this diag linked list. So the containing enumerable has a different pointer to the root of its list, but when it's passed into that struct enumerator, the data is always the same. So just sort of how it's implemented, there's no checking that's going on inside that enumerator. It's always newed up with the same thing.
But then the class wouldn't need to be abstract.
The parent ones, yes, they're implemented by these different sort of container things.
Sorry, I don't understand. What derives from activity item enumerable?
It should be there. There's like 3 of them. So there's 2 different lists. There's one that's specifically for tags, right there on line 1342. There's a baggage. If you go up a little bit more, there's probably one for the tag objects. There's one for events. There's one for links.
I see. And it's the get enumerator that's actually deciding what data to pass into the enumerator. And then this is relying on the fact that the implementation will always use the same data layout for anything that derives from this type.
Right.
And that's what we expect to be the case moving forward.
Vertiteric on that one.
Yeah, like we already using the same kind of linked list structures underneath. I mean, for most of this, yeah. So I would expect, yeah, in the future if we add any more properties, which is unlikely, but if it happens, yeah, using the same internal structure will be okay at that time.
Then my concerns aren't applicable. Can you go back to the API overview?
One thing to call out, if you look at the usage, so you always have to cast. So the public API is always exposing IEnumerable. We're not changing that. We're just saying in OpenTelemetry, we will just cast as this new type. And then from there, it will all work fine.
What you're casting in order to get access to the struct enumerator?
Correct.
You want the strongly typed one?
Yep.
So we'll basically document that although it's typed to return IEnumerable, it's actually this thing.
Yeah, we are going to document this, and we are going to have some tests also to validate. I mean, to make sure that this is the case all the time. Yeah.
And presumably, this abstract class has an internal constructor, right?
Yeah, I was going to say, it doesn't seem like anyone outside this assembly would ever be capable of implementing it correctly. So should we add a internal or private constructor, presumably internal, so that the ref assembly will say that it cannot be derived by anybody else?
I mean, why wouldn't we just add methods? Like enumerate tags, enumerate events, enumerate links, and they would just return the correct type?
Yeah, so the problem with that is today, I mean, for example, I mean, with tags, we already have 2 properties. We have tags and object tags inside activity. So adding extra method to do that, it will be like 3 things returning the same list at the end, which would be very confusing for the users.
Yeah, that's why I suggested methods rather than properties. And just say you call the method, because it's kind of an advanced scenario, right?
Right. Yeah.
If you care about the perf, then you would do that. And at that point, it might actually be easier to just have dedicated nested enumerators for those types.
Yeah, but my point is still valid about, like, if I'm user and looking at activity documentation and seeing like 3 things returning tags, I will be very confused.
But that's why I think it's important to make them methods, because I think, like, as a user, I mean, kind of like if you think about it, right, methods represent different kinds of operations you can do, right? And then the properties kind of represent the data that the thing logically represents. And so I wouldn't mess with that. I would just say, yep, there's specialized methods that you can call that give you a faster enumeration mechanism. And that's something that, you know, our partners can call. But I don't think, like personally, I think having a contract where basically arbitrary things can be cast to some derived type, I think is problematic for two reasons. One, it's very hard to discover, but then also it's somewhat fragile for us, right? That's why I'm not a huge fan of the casting.
Basically that, Emo, if you can see my screen. Adding a new method called something like enumerate tag objects that returns the strongly typed enumerable, and then change the existing IEnumerable property to just return that call and be call compatible with the previous code.
Correct. I mean, you could even say, I mean, I'm not even sure that we need the abstract class at that point, right? We could just say that enumerate tag objects is effectively returning a struct that does whatever you want it to do, right? And we have one per type that we care about.
I mean, you know, you'd still need it to be a public type that said that it had a struct based iterator.
I think what emo means is like if you look at what we added for, like, was it enumerate runes or runes, and I think on string builders enumerate chunks. Basically, it returns the struct enumerator, which has a get enumerator method that just returns itself.
Right.
Right.
Like it seems that given that these methods are not doing anything you can't already do, right? The whole point of those methods is to just do it faster with as low overhead as possible, right? So that's why I'm just generally questioning the wisdom of having an abstract class in the middle. Like, why would you not just return the struct that is dedicated to this particular thing?
Yeah, I'm just trying to think about the implementation details here.
What's the expected for consumption? I mean, the API usage shows just a for each. Is that actually the consumption, or would some consumption actually get the activity item enumerable and hold on to it and then iterate that thing multiple times?
Lunch?
Open telemetry. I mean, today we're using that whole reflection engine thing. So it's not really a for each. It's sort of, I mean, it is, but I would like to go and recode it once we have this API so that it's just a for each. This is sort of in our export pipeline. So the activity has finished. We've decided to sample it. Our goal is just to take all the data on the activity and convert it to some other export format that OpenTelemetry supports. So it's always a loop. So we'll loop all the tags, all the activities, all the links, and then if there's tags on those, we'll sub loop. So just a lot of looping and for each allocations happening, which is why we went to the reflection. But we won't need to hold on to that enumerator. It shouldn't ever jump threads. There's no async in any of that either. It's all on a dedicated background thread. Everything runs in kind of a synchronous way. I don't think that changes anything with that, but does that kind of make sense?
Yeah, if that wasn't the answer, with that answer, I don't have a strong opinion between what Emo's proposing and what's being proposed here. If that wasn't the answer and it was, oh, we need to hold on to the enumerable and enumerate it multiple times, there are advantages to what's on the screen.
I mean, another option is, I'm not sure whether that makes more sense or less sense, but presumably you want to take the data and do something with it, right? Like, would it be better to have a method like copy to span or something that just gives you access to those things rather than you doing it manually, or you just iterating to, querying it effectively?
But copy to span, you will need to allocate something to copy to it, right?
Right, but it could be something, stack allocated if it's like, 12, right? If it's like hundreds of them, then maybe not, right?
Yeah, we expecting to have many things like events. It will be too many. This one thing, and second thing, with the span, we will need to copy at that time, right? To copy the internal structs, which is we need to avoid here.
Steve, am I remembering the struct self iterator thing with what I have on screen? That you declare it to be both an enumerable and an enumerator, and get enumerator just says return this?
Yes. Yes. Whether, yeah.
Do you even have to
but-
implement IEnumerable? I think you don't have to, right?
I honestly don't remember whether for each matches a pattern or not.
I believe it matches the pattern that you have a thing that calls get enumerator, and the type that it returns has a current and a move next. So technically you can drop all of the interfaciness, but then it would make, the existing property complicated. Like, you couldn't just return the new thing because it wouldn't conform.
Right. Although at the same
presumably
time,
the existing property would just return the data, right? Whatever it has today.
that's going to make the existing thing more expensive. I mean, every time you call tag objects, it allocates, which you don't want.
Right.
Or you have two copies of the code, the way it currently does it and the way that it would do it now. And
Another downside to this is we'll need 3 different versions of this struct. One for tags, one for activities, one for events. So we'll have 3 public structs. I don't know if that's an issue.
I mean, it may be good or bad, right? It depends on how much you want to, how much flexibility do you want in the implementation for these 3. If the code path is identical for all of them, then maybe that's not great. But
I don't know that that's true. If doesn't the same thing apply when you call enumerate tag objects, if you're just going to be for eaching it directly, and that's the expected use case, then the enumerator that you can construct inside enumerate tag objects is just constructed with whatever that data node pointer was.
yeah, assuming the data structure is the same, then yes.
yeah, and if your T's are different across them, these are actually different structs. You're just using, generics to compress them. Similarly, if you wanted a activity item enumerator of T, that would work here. I just went with inlining the T's. But if it's just a whatever, we'll tell you what T you get. That's
Yeah, so you are saying it would be one struct, but generic struct, right? Okay.
That's better.
Yeah.
And could we still do the read-only ref on the current?
should work. It doesn't know any reason why it wouldn't. I mean, like, that should work.
Yeah, this of key value pair will be.
Yeah. So, yes. Still adding a type, just getting rid of the abstract class.
Okay.
And then if
does
you...
it does it matter if the struct is read only or not?
Well, it can't be because move next can't be. You want move next to have a side effect. This is the one time we generally allow mutable structs. Is when they're an iterator.
Yeah, forget about my question now.
See, for the string builder one, we didn't implement IEnumerable and IEnumerator on the struct in chunk enumerator.
I don't remember. Are you asking or telling?
I'm saying we didn't.
Oh, okay.
Looking at the code, and so do we need it here? Do we need it or do we want it here?
I would say we don't need it because if you actually genuinely want to use link, you just go over tag objects directly.
Right, well,
this is only if you want the fast.
But if the chunk enumerator was exposing data that we never previously had, then it was adding a new scenario and it could fit. The question is if. To me, the question is if this doesn't enumerate these interfaces, how is the current version of tag objects going to be written? If we say it implements the interfaces, the only time that matters is if somebody calls them from something using the interface cast, and but if it doesn't implement the interfaces, then this has to be completely parallel code.
I think you're going to want to anyway. You don't want line 6. Every time you call tag objects, you're going to box the struct.
Yeah, presumably tag objects today return the underlying like data source we currently have, right, which already is enumerable, right? So you don't actually write any code for that. Presumably it returns an array or a list or whatever the thing is that actually contains those tag objects, right? And presumably that doesn't change, right? Enumerate tag objects is just doing that enumeration in a better way, right?
Fair enough. So likely it would be take the current thing but change, public here to internal, assuming they can get away with an internal intermediate base. And the tag objects would just keep calling its current version of enumeration, and this guy would go to the new public sideline type. So, fair enough.
It's not just enumerate tag objects, right? There are 2 others as well. We'd be adding multiple methods here.
Yeah, so it would be however many. So looks like
the 3, right? Links,
baggage tags, diags. Yeah. So
tags, links, and events, I believe. Okay, so I missed the point about like the new method will return this struct. I mean, this struct is going to can be used with for each or not?
For each is pattern matching because .NET Framework 1 didn't have generics. So the rules for each is the thing after the word in has to have a method called getEnumerator, and then the type that says it returns has to have a property called moveNext and a property called current. Sorry, a method called moveNext and a property called current.
So it doesn't depend on IEnumerable or I.
No, those just guarantee that you have something that matches the pattern. I guess the other thing is it can be IEnumerable, the non-generic one, but the generic one just forces you to match the pattern. And it's why the generic actually gets preferred, because the pattern gets preferred over the interface.
Yeah, for each will work with anything that has those patterns, so you don't even have to implement the interfaces. It just means if you don't implement the interfaces, you can't do link or anything else that depends on IEnumerable, which I don't think you care for.
Yeah, so it basically limits you to for each. So if somebody wanted to do link with it, they could write their own yield return based statement on top of it.
Well, they just use the existing property, right? Because it returns the same thing.
In this case, but it's if going forward they only exposed it via enumerate methods instead of with enumerable properties. So.
That's true, yeah. I think in the general case you want to enable link, right? So, but I think in this case it would just be the data is linkable, but then the methods are the fast path, right? So I guess.
All right, so I mean, I just whipped up a name here. So if this is the path we're recommending, is activity item enumerator the right name?
Yes. Looks
Seems good. Why would it not be nested? Do you expect this to be used outside of activity?
Well, then there's the other question of, like, that Steve pointed out. I wrote down one thing and there's at least three. And so then we need to, add what the three things are. I don't know that they're all in activity.
Yeah, I think they're all in activity, right? It's tags, bags, and links, right? Or whatever the thing is.
yeah, tags, links, and events.
Or event.
Yeah. Of course, the generic type will be different there, but you can.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's called the activity link, and activity event. Yeah. That looks good to me.
Okay. So is this what we're recommending instead of the proposal?
If we do everything we've talked about, these three methods will effectively be snapshots, right? Because the lists that the struct wraps are immutable. Is that true?
Yeah, I mean the list can grow or can, yeah, it can grow or can be decreased.
But given a node in the list, I can hold on to that forever, and I'm guaranteed it and everything reachable from it won't change. Is that a true or false statement?
Yes, it's true.
It's true. Yeah. So these are snapshot. These are snapshot at the time you call the method.
Yeah, but I think if during the enumeration, if the list grow, so it can enumerate the new stuff that inside it if it didn't get into it.
So my statement was false.
It's not. Yeah, it's not snapshots. What it guarantee about, like, if you have a pointer to any node inside the list, so this node will be valid as long as you point to it, and the next to it, I mean the next pointer will be either pointing to another node which will be valid, or it point to null, which is saying like.
But once things go, I mean, I guess if your key value pair string object is an object that's not itself immutable, anything can happen. But you can't remove tags, links, or events, right?
You can remove tags. You can remove tags at least.
So you can end up in a state here where your iterator is now outside of reality. Your current node is pointing at a thing that is no longer in the list, and next will do something.
Okay, so I don't think this is a concern here. I mean, like, because like it's the case today, right? I mean, we don't return snapshot for these properties anyway. So we are not going to make anything worse. I mean, and also our list is we are using a linked list specifically, I mean, to ensure that the enumeration will be safe. Even if you mutate the list, it still be safe to enumerate through it. It might be not matching exactly the current state if it get mutated, but but it's safe to enumerate over it.
I guess I can look at the implementation, but if I'm pointing to one of these, what do we call them? Diag nodes or something?
Yeah.
If I have a reference to one of those nodes,
Mhm.
and that node is removed from the list,
Yes.
what happens when I try and go next or previous?
It will go, there is no previous, but if you go to next, it will be the next inside this node that you are holding on.
So removing from a list doesn't mutate. When a node is removed from the list, that node isn't mutated.
Yeah, the node itself is not mutated,
What
but
if
the list is mutated. Yeah.
what if the next node is removed? Then my node is patched with the next. Is that right?
Okay. So
I'll look at the implementation. It's fine.
yeah. I mean, if you remove the next and the current node is not removed yet, yeah, it will point to next. Yes.
But if you remove the current node and then remove the node that used to be after it, you're still going to walk through another node that was removed from your list.
That's right.
Because and you're not setting next to null when something
Yeah.
was removed, which would just make move next fail.
That's right.
I mean, aside from saying that
basically,
you
you're
need to
saying
track
it's-
mutation and throw, I don't know that changes any of this here.
Yeah, my concern was going to be if removing actually caused next to be set to null, then when you're creating this struct, if the node that it points to was then removed, you would fail to enumerate anything else in the list. But it sounds like that's not the case.
Yeah, basically you never crash. You just may get results that don't match your expectations, right? But that might be fine.
Yeah, but back to my point about snapshotting. So while it's not snapshotting in that things around the node can still change, I'm going to be creating this struct with whatever the current head pointer is at that time. And then if I for each over the returned struct multiple times, I will only ever start iterating from the head that was captured, not anything that may have been added since. And we're okay with that.
I think that will be okay for our scenarios. Yes.
I mean, considering these are methods, I think it's fine. I think there will be properties that will be very confusing potentially, right?
I mean, right now they're properties, and I guess the difference would be with this new thing. It's we've captured the node before you called get enumerator. And
right. Normally we capture state on the first move next call, or on the get enumerator call rather.
That's right. Yeah.
Whereas this is capturing on the thing that produces the enumerable.
Right. But it would basically mean somebody would have to snapshot the result to a variable, right? Which is somewhat
Right, which was getting at my question earlier about do we expect the same thing to be enumerated, to be grabbed once and then enumerated multiple times?
Yeah.
But if the pattern is just for each enumerate links, for each enumerate events, there's no issue, because at that point the difference between get enumerator and the method call is indistinguishable.
yeah, but right, and the enumerating it multiply is still fine, because when you call get enumerator, you get an independent thing that has the current node.
Yeah.
So there's one copy of the struct more than you needed, but it that's fine.
Yeah, I mean the whole
model, you wouldn't be able to enumerate multiple times. You would have to call the method again, right? You would snapshot again.
Right. Well, it's when you get this object, because it's actually representing an enumerable. So I was looking to see what we did for string builder to see if we should call this enumerator or something else. But the when the for each then calls get enumerator, that gets a copy of this, which is still pointing at the head node, and that's fine. Like, you needed a second register-sized space on the stack. Whatever. And then the first one will possibly even just pop away. So it's kind of a no-op.
I guess I'm not following. If you for each over the result, like if you snapshot enumerate links, let's say, into a local variable and you for each it, I don't even think that's compiled today. I think in order for you to enumerate, you literally have to say for each x in enumerate links.
Why?
Because I think the compiler won't let you for each and enumerate more directly. I think the compiler will only let you for each something that gives you something that has a get enumerator method on it.
So the struct does that. It has a get enumerator method on it.
We should check, but I thought that didn't work. I think I tried that before and it didn't work. I might be wrong, but even if the compiler let you do it, right? I think the problem is the enumerator just returns this. So once you're done, like basically, if you've done this once, that means next time you call it, it will immediately terminate and move next return.
Get enumerator returns a copy.
Right?
Yeah. Because
get
this
enumerator returns a copy. That's by value.
Yeah. So each of the for eaches turns into, it'll turn into another activity.
And maybe I don't know what the state is that it's back, but it returns the thing when you call get enumerator, right? If the field itself is just the current node, then you would return
Right.
enumerator whose current node is the
So
last
if
node.
you did something weird and you called enumerate whatever and you saved it as a local, and then you called move next on it, and then you put it in a for each, the for each will only see what's after the move next, because the call to get enumerator is basically clone me in my current state. But since if you save it as a local and you just iterate it, that called get enumerator, so it got a copy at the head, walked through the whole thing until it returned false. The copy is now dead, but this original one is not. So if you go to enumerate it a second time, when it calls get enumerator, you get another copy pointing at the head node.
I see what you're saying. Okay,
Struct
Oh.
enumerators are
I
magic.
see.
So get enumerator will not return this then, right?
It does.
Always
But if you return this from a struct, you return a copy.
okay. Okay. So you are saying we will have a field that always pointing to the head of the list inside the struct.
Well, just no. It's
Right.
it works. If you write it the simple way and pretend you didn't support multiple iteration and it's a struct, it just works. The copy that it makes when you call get enumerator just works. The only thing that doesn't work is if here you said, oh, I see that you have a thing called move next, so call it. Now both of these will only do the second through final thing. They'll both skip the first one because the seed enumerable moved its
Right.
state past the first one. But don't do that because the for each loops only do it off of this copy.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I mean, like, if somebody, as you said, that calling move next manually.
We don't care what they do.
Okay, but in the middle of this, I mean, of this enumeration, somebody, I mean, like, called get enumerator from the struct that they point to it.
Like,
So they will get a snapshot from the same thing, which is the middle of the enumeration, right?
if they're using for each, they can't touch the iterator directly. So this is
No.
only for people who grabbed the object and wrote a manual for each with a while loop.
I'm not talking about for each. I'm talking about if somebody manually doing like move next or something like this, and somehow in the middle they try to get a new enumerator from it.
Right. So if they do
Right.
some stuff, and then in here call some method of able. This will only see a from here to the end iterator, because they didn't actually call get enumerator, so they're not doing the pattern right.
Okay, so you are saying it's okay, I mean, to
You-
get the same state of, okay.
Again, but this is wrong. This is not the pattern. It functions, but what they
Right,
should have
but-
done was call.
But it doesn't mean nobody would do that. I mean, like, people
Sure.
can do that. And we want to make sure that they are not going to hit themselves.
I mean,
So maybe
if you're unrolling for each and you shoot yourself in the foot, then don't unroll for each.
should just get enumerator always return a clean state copy of struct.
I mean, you can make it if you care. Your struct's bigger because you're saving the current and the head.
Yeah.
Or the current in the way of achieving the head, if you care
Yeah.
about the new things being added in the head position.
Yeah.
Yeah, but that's implementation detail. Like, we really don't care what happens if somebody writes this code. Generally. Yeah, so for naming, has anybody looked up what we did for the chunk enumerator?
We call it enumerator.
Okay. So we did return, and we called the thing enumerate tor, even though you use it as an enumerable, but okay. That's fine.
Good.
So, okay, so then the only outstanding question is this a peer type or a nested type? And if everything that it's ever going to be used for is a child of activity, then it should just be a nested type because nobody's going to consume it directly.
Okay, if it is nested type, so we'll just remove the name activity from it. I mean, like it will be item enumerator only.
I mean, I think it's fine to leave the word. I don't care. Does anybody care?
Yeah, just it will be less typing, I believe. Yeah, I'm just from the. I mean, the user code will just write activity item enumerator, right?
The user code should never talk about the type. They should just say for each.
Oh, yeah.
If they say for each, this type doesn't appear. Otherwise, we wouldn't put it in a nested type. So somebody's being weird if they're talking about the type directly.
Why not just call it enumerator? Why have item in front of it?
That's fair. I guess enumerator is what we generally call our nested enumerator types, unless we have two of them.
My only hesitancy, and you guys would know best, Tarek and Blanche, whether this is the case. Like, activity looks like it's got a whole lot of stuff on it. What are the chances there's going to be something else we're going to want to enumerate?
I think baggage is highly likely. Maybe. There's some issues with, for OpenTelemetry, baggage is independent of the trace. So we don't use activity baggage today. We have our own baggage because you can technically have baggage happening on like a metric when there is no trace happening. But if we can solve that.
And it would use the same enumerator type or a different enumerator type?
Yeah, similar. I mean, same.
Okay. So I guess my question was really, is it likely we're going to ever have another enumerator type on activity? If yes, we should probably use a more specific name. If no, let's make it as simple as possible.
Okay, so for now, I mean, like it looks unlikely we'll get another enumerator type here, but I don't know about like in the future we will get some weird case that we will need it. So I would vote just to be more specific here than just generic name.
Then what do you want to call it? Because even if it was back what I originally wrote as a side type of activity item enumerator, and like baggage is an item, so why isn't it using item enumerator? Why is it using baggage enumerator?
Yeah, I mean, for baggage, for sure, we will use the same thing. I mean, so it's not an issue, but yeah, I'm fine with.
I'm just the problem is because you're doing 3 different kinds of things and it's a generic type. Any name you come up with is going to be general, because
That's right. Yeah,
so I can't going from the activity item type to activity item enumerator to item enumerator to enumerator. Those are really all the same. I'm stuff. Like there's just more words for the stuff.
So the flip side of this naming discussion is hopefully no one literally ever utters this name. Right? You should never see this in anyone's code.
Right.
Okay.
Because if somebody just writes like the name of the enumerator never appeared in this code. And even if you expand far to TBD, like that's the name of the enumerable never appeared. The name of the iterator never appeared. It only appears in the code that only the compiler sees as it's turning things into IL. That's why we use the nested type for it, because no one cares.
So if we really think there's a low chance, maybe not 0, but very low chance that there will be another one of these, then enumerator makes sense.
I didn't follow? Can you explain that again, Steve?
Oh, I was saying, if we believe that there is maybe not a 0 chance, but a very low chance that we'd ever need another such enumerator, then just calling it enumerator is fine. My concern was there's like, I don't know, 50 members or something on activity. It's really big. It seems likely that there might be yet another thing we want to enumerate that might not share the same one, and then it's weird to have enumerator and more specific enumerator. But if it's really the former case, then it's fine to just have it be enumerator.
Yeah. I mean, even if we ended up with, it's just enumerator and baggage enumerator, since most people don't see it, it doesn't super matter. It'd be a little weird of like, why doesn't it do it? But I think in string builder, we must have that. Otherwise, we probably wouldn't have named chunk enumerator chunk. So yeah. So I think this is reasonable and sounds like it solves the scenario. And I feel compelled to look up what the right type is for links.
Activity link. Or activity event for the next one. Yeah.
And I do have this is really out of curiosity about this whole scenario. Why is it that enumeration in this case is so critical? I would have naively thought that there would have been a lot more expense in actually populating this content on the activity, and enumeration would only happen once and would be dwarfed by those other costs. That's not the case?
Yeah, the point is OpenTelemetry is processing many activities, it's not just one. So they enumerating all the time, almost.
And the same activity gets enumerated multiple times?
No, not the same activity, but different activities.
Sure. So if you look at the cost associated with one activity, there's some cost associated with populating it, and there's some cost associated with enumerating it. And so the cost associated with the activity as a whole, I would have thought the cost of OpenTelemetry's enumerating it would be very small comparatively. But it sounds like that's not true. I'm just trying to understand why.
It's really just this goal we have to be able to achieve 0 allocation exporting. So if we're writing into like ETW or we're reusing like a memory buffer, it's just really nice benchmark to show that it's non-allocating. And most of our allocations were coming from the structs in the
So
40.
I get that, but does it actually, I understand things can be made to look really good on micro benchmarks. Does it actually affect the all up scenario?
Would anyone care if it was allocating these 40 bytes or whatever? Probably not. The bigger perf hit that we saw was actually on the current, where we were copying the current struct 2 times. In some cases, it's 3 times. So I think actually the ref on the current will help more than just the struct on the enumerator itself. But it was, since we're here, since we're doing it, it seemed to make sense to do it.
Even that though, and again, if you guys own these APIs, like you know what your goals and scenarios are, it's fine. But in order for something to be enumerated from, say, activity link, it had to be populated into links, which required allocating a diag node and taking a lock and adding it into the list. All those costs should dwarf 1 or 2 extra copies of an activity link reference, for example. So I understand micro benchmarking the enumerator and costs of the enumerator showing up, but in the grand scheme of things, I'm having a little trouble wrapping my head around how this could actually move the needle.
Right. So, Steve, to see if I understand your concern, this would be you run your scenario of you have your app, benchmark your app, now turn on the trace exporter, look at your benchmark, can you tell that it actually was turned on?
And more specifically, can you tell that the enumeration, like does the enumeration show up on your trace?
Because if turning on the
No.
exporter without doing all of this makes your, 2
The
millisecond
user will
operation be
never see it.
2.001.
Because, I mean, from the user's perspective, the activity has stopped. They don't see the measurement of the time it took the SDK to do its bookkeeping, if that makes sense.
I didn't follow that. Can you say it again?
So, like, when it comes to the export phase, the trace has already terminated, so the time has been captured. So, like, our time spent enumerating and exporting won't be reflected in the traces when they show up in whatever visualization the user is using. So there, it's not really going to impact user land. Like when I start tracing my application using the .NET API, this will have no impact on me whatsoever. So they're going to have to pay for newing the activity. They're going to have to pay for the cost of adding all the tags, links, whatever they want to do. This is purely for the SDK's performance in its export pipeline.
And from the moment that I say start export and the export finishes, that's a measurable amount of time, and this will decrease that measurable time measurably?
Nanoseconds.
Okay.
So no.
It's important
Nanoseconds
to us, the SDK team, but it's not that big of a performance issue.
Well, Tara can decide what he wants to do here. I do question adding this complexity for that level of gain, but it's up to you guys.
Yeah, my whole concern here is about OpenTelemetry today is doing reflection, and this is the part that I don't like.
No,
So-
sure, but I'm assuming we're talking about is the difference not between reflection in this, but the difference between enumerating tag objects and enumerating enumerate tag objects. Like, I understand the reflection stuff was added because there were goals set around
Yeah,
micro benchmarks for enumeration.
right.
And then the
Just want to
question
make sure
is,
we're
are those
investing in things that actually matter and not just
are those artificial goals or are they useful goals? I think, is the question.
Okay, so we can take it offline with the OpenTelemetry guys one more time. I mean, just to make sure that if the perf is really very critical, I mean, in this part, and if it is not, so we can just like, I don't know about like, if OpenTelemetry will accept to just remove the reflection part or not. But if they don't, I mean, so I think we will need these APIs. But if they will accept that, I mean, to use tags object property directly, so I think we'll be fine not introducing these APIs. So yeah, I mean, like make it like bending on the discussion with OpenTelemetry one more time.
Thank you.
Well, yeah. I think if you decide you need it, this is what we're going to end up with as the answer.
Right.
So probably from a paperwork perspective, we should call this approved. But just because the shape's approved, I think Steve is suggesting you don't actually do the feature. Or Steve is suggesting you question whether or not you should do the feature.
I'm suggesting we validate that the end goal is actually meaningful. Okay, if you told me like export took a minute and this lowered it to 50 seconds, like great, okay, that's a significant improvement. We should absolutely do this. If it's export takes 60 seconds and this lowers it to 59.59, like, I mean, does anyone really care? Other than it looks really good when we micro benchmark the part where we're just doing the enumeration and this shaves off the allocation that wasn't actually an issue because nothing else was happening on the box that caused garbage collection to, pause the world and blah, 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 blah. So anyhow, sounds like you know what's next, so go ahead and figure it out.
Thank you.
All right. Enhance requires dynamic code attribute to apply to class. 67368.
Hi, I'm Lakshan. I can speak to this. So basically, in this release, we are planning to preview native AOT form factor, and as part of that, we want to annotate libraries, and this attribute is used in native AOT to kind of indicate that pretty much requires runtime code generation, so not suitable for native AOT applications. And like, just to give context, it's very similar to the trimming form factor where there is an attribute called requires unreferenced code attribute. And this request is just to make the target the same as requires unreferenced attribute. And the usage is with this way, we can mark whole classes as not suitable for native AOT. And reject compiler is a good example where there's a significant amount of basically runtime code generation. And rather than kind of sprinkle this attribute through various members, just having this on the class itself is cleaner and also serves the purpose of kind of making sure that certain classes are not used in applications at all. So that's the background. I can answer some additional things. I believe Eric also is familiar with it, so he might also kind of have some context on this.
So, for something like this, I think a general concern with putting the attribute at a type level is that sometimes you end up with things like, the static is supported property that should be callable even in AOT, so you end up with this, once you have one member that should be callable, you're still forcing everyone to paint everything else and move things around, which is fine. It is annoying. So it's there's a general, is it worth painting a whole type ever? And then number two, I don't know why we got it wrong on requires unreferenced code. Why would we say class and not also struct?
I can answer the second one. Or Blackstone, do you want to go?
No, Eric, go ahead.
For the second one, is because we couldn't always tell if the struct is actually going to be used because of things like default constructors. We couldn't deterministically, statically know that this struct was going to get passed into this method. If that makes any sense, like in the trimmer. So that's why because we can't even tell if a struct is instantiated anywhere in the.
But you would know in code that wasn't marked as requires unreferenced code that there was a local of that type. Or it was used as a generic argument, or etc. Right? Like you would know that a type was being
some things,
used,
but you can't know all the time.
I don't quite see how, but I'll trust you.
I can dig up from the requires unreferenced code. Like Mikhail can explain it way better than I can.
Yeah, I mean, it feels like the only thing that would possibly slip through the cracks is you had a unused local that got initialized with default, but then never called any members on it, so who cares? But that once you called a member, it'd be, well, you're calling a member off of a type that was declared unreferenced code, so you need to be in an unreferenced code context. Basically saying that the type applies it to all the members, except the default constructor, because who cares?
I think it's also with interfaces as well. I'll dig it up and send it. Like there's reasons.
I can understand interfaces not doing it because an interface has no implementation.
No, I meant
dims, but
when a struct implements an interface, it was like another thing that we couldn't tell.
Fair, but you would similarly have that with a class problem, right? To go back to we were doing IEnumerables, if you're a class that's only ever being returned as IEnumerable and you see that you require unreferenced code, there's nothing visibly saying that unreferenced code is involved in this application.
With classes, we can tell because we can see the calls to their constructor. With structs, you can't. You can't see all the calls ever.
Okay.
Because again, like default, right? Things like that.
Fair enough. I guess you could have a default instance of a struct that when you call some method, it then uses reflection. So the default state had meaning, just was okay. You'd still see the box appear. So you could have failed it at the box, but whatever.
For the first question, or at least about like the API, like one of the biggest reasons this kind of needs to be on class is so you can, like your internal code, you can just slap it on a class and you can say like this whole class requires dynamic code, so don't add a bunch of warnings to every method and static fields and whatnot. You can just put this attribute on the whole class, and the analyzer doesn't warn you for every place that's doing dynamic code things inside the class.
And there were a couple of patterns around that, what just Eric described, and similar to what you asked earlier, Jeremy. So there are some guards, but both in regex and I saw in JSON as well, where there are some kind of, basically the internal code should not get called, and it's much kind of, easier to slap it on the class rather than just sprinkle everywhere that it is used, given that the whole feature is not native AOT compatible. That's the motivation.
So, not that it's written down somewhere, but that in your heads, it's putting it on a type should mainly be done for non-public types, and for public types, you should only paint the members.
My understanding, yes, the experience I've seen so far has been that pattern.
I mean, we'd probably do that, but I could imagine third parties just wanting to paint the whole class and call it done.
Sure. That's why if you wrote down a recommendation, it would potentially be that for describing a contract, you should only put it at the method level, but for convenience, you can do it on an internal class to shut up all the suppressions. But fair enough. So
if you had your scenario of if you had an is supported property, then you definitely don't want it on your whole class.
Right.
Well, like something like dynamic method, right? Which its only thing it exists for is to make dynamic code. Kind of like painting that on the class.
Right. I mean, things like is supported and saying, well, you can, if you had one of these things, calling count won't use unreferenced code, but how did you get it? Like they're niche, but it is a concern, so I asked. All right. So if unreferenced code had a structs are hard to track problem, does dynamic code have the same problem, or should it be all types, or all defined types, or just class?
I'm not absolutely sure of that, but I would imagine it's the same pattern as the trimming or static analysis as well. Native AOT is a subset of the trimming kind of surface area and does use some of its similar analysis. I don't know whether Eric you kind of have more on this.
My thought is we should match requires unreferenced code.
Yeah.
Like it's the same. It definitely in like the analysis part, like for the native AOT stuff, it's going to be the same engine, if you will, doing the analysis for requires unreferenced code as requires dynamic code. So I would just put class, not struct.
Anybody other than me feel like talking?
Well, you're saying fine words, so keep talking.
All right. I don't see a reason to say anything other than yes. All right.
Oh, that's mine. Actually, I finished this morning. I wasn't sure if we were gonna go over today. I thought it was just gonna go over next week. I'm fine if we want to push it to next week, as long as we get it in before preview 4. I think it's good. So, yeah.
Steve, I think you're behind index not of. So, would you rather talk about regex enumerator index not of?
Regex enumerator.
All right.
Assuming Jose is fine with it.
I'm fine. It's just, yeah, I'm fine.
Okay, so using the interpretation of a red thing popped up before we got to a white thing, let's do the red thing. So, had regex enumerate over a read-only span of char, which is allocation free, 65011. Joe, you're up.
Sure. Thank you. So basically, for .NET 7, we've added a bunch of spanification all over regex. So a few APIs that are taking span as an input as opposed to string. But all of said APIs that we've added so far don't actually return you back the actual match. So we have added, for example, stuff like isMatch or count that basically only return if there was a match or not in the input, or if like how many matches were there present in the input. This is the first API that actually returns you back where the match is located. The reason why, by the way, we haven't done this in the past is because the match type is a reference type, and one of the most important properties it has inside is, of course, the value of the substring that matched. And so this would require an allocation and cannot, of course, save as a field a read-only span a char. So basically, in order to support this, we need to instead have a struct which can hold the span, a ref struct that can hold the span and can iterate over it. So the proposal in here is basically to add an enumerate matches. This actual ref, this is the enumerator that I was talking in chat that was pretty similar to the one that was proposed by Tarek. But basically, it's also just a ref struct match enumerator. And it just returns you back a struct, a custom struct called the value match for now, which today will only contain the range of where that match was found. The reason why we're returning a custom struct as opposed to just having current return the range is because in the future we are planning to also add capture support. So this struct will have additional property inside of it. We still haven't finalized on the shape of that, but basically we want to be able to enable the option of somebody to fetch the capture data as well. So yeah, that's basically the API, and all of the static overloads, they just match all of the rest of the overloads that we have for every single API, where we have the instance method, and then we have the overloads, the static overloads that take in the pattern, the options, and the timeout. And yeah, that's pretty much the proposal.
Okay. Before we talk about this one, this proposal has reminded me that with a struct-based enumerator, the get enumerator call can be declared read-only, so I think I should go fix the one for Tarek.
Yeah, after all of that chat, because it does create a copy, does it actually have a lot of impact? Because you're still going to create the copy, right?
You create the copy, but it won't, if for some reason you had it in a read-only context, it won't create a copy in order to create the copy.
Okay. Sounds good. Yeah, I basically added just by design. I wanted to add all of the so all of the methods that were not actually modifying the internal structure. I just marked them as read-only to provide basically prevent defensive copies when we could.
Right. Yeah, which is good, and I missed that when we did Tarek's version of this. So I ask this question every time, and usually the answer is we're matching a thing, and who cares? Do we want 3 overloads, or do we want 1 overload or do we want to collapse these a little bit by using default parameters?
We had that discussion a few weeks ago for regex.count, and the decision there was let's just match isMatch, match, matches, which all follow the same pattern. So I think either we should revisit for count and go back on that previous decision, or we just keep with the same structure.
Right. So because we're mimicking an existing API, we're going to match the overload shapes it had, but we would still feel if this was a brand new type, we would debate more about collapsing them.
I don't know because of trimming. Well, sorry, I'll let.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was going to say.
Okay.
Yeah, so it depends on trimming, because if you don't pass any of the options, we do have kind of like it calls a different internal constructor that won't.
Right. Well, even under our defaulted parameters suggestions, it would only be these last 2 that collapsed into 1.
Yeah, the issue is it's options, Oh, you're saying you would
Yeah.
still have pattern? You
Because-
still have one that just took pattern.
Because in this case, you would have two default parameters, and then our suggestion, because of IntelliSense with square brackets and new users, etc., is once you have two or more, to have the overload that had none of them. So this one would have still been special anyway.
I see.
So
We-
it's,
we-
should these two collapse into optional options and optional timeout, and then this one's special and these two are the same, but I don't care.
There's one more consideration here, which, and I think all these considerations together means we should just keep doing what we're doing. The other consideration is we make a distinction between
Infinite times.
explicitly specifying a timeout and not. So if you explicitly specify, like if you don't specify a timeout, you're getting an infinite timeout. However, there is still a difference between that and explicitly specifying an infinite timeout. And that is, if you explicitly specify an infinite timeout, that is it. You get infinite. There is nothing that's going to change that. If you rely on it being implicitly specified because you didn't pass one in, then you are subject to the default that is settable via app context.
Yeah, I mean, I would, if we collapsed it, this would become nullable.
Right. And at which point it becomes even more different from the other ones.
Yeah, I'm again totally behind the notion that because we're putting it on an existing type, we're matching the existing pattern of no defaults in these overloads. But since we have started accepting them, it's a question that I feel that we should ask every time we see multiple overloads pop up. So
that's a good question. I'm curious, Jose. You probably inherited this from my original suggestion that we just enumerate return ranges. Did you give any thought to whether value match would expose a single range or an index and a length? Or
yeah, so as you can recall, like my prototype actually had it was returning the span instead of the range. But I chatted with Jeremy this morning offline, and yeah, because we well, I mean, I'm sure that he can explain it better, but because we want to support things like, first of all, what happens if it's read-only memory as opposed to read-only span, we instead want to provide the range back so that they can index into the span themselves, like the caller can index into the span itself. And I believe another concern that you had, Jeremy, was that this may be a writable span instead.
There are 4 types that can collapse down, and 5 if you count string. 4 that can collapse down into read-only span of char, right? It's read-only span of char, read-only memory of char, and memory of char, and then string, and array of char. Those can all go in, and you can't get back to whatever your seed type was if you get back a span.
Yeah, that all makes sense, and I agree with all of that. My question was simpler. Public range versus public int index and public int length.
Oh, got it.
And I personally don't have a strong care between those. I think when we did the PIM encoder, we went with range because then you just use the square bracket syntax, and that people were excited about that. I don't care, so.
Yeah, I'm also fine with either or. The reason why I fell back to range was because that's what you originally had, and that addresses Jeremy's concern about not using the span. But I'm fine if we instead want to use index. That's fine. Index and length.
I would be tempted to just use index and length and mirror what we have on match today.
Yeah. Since it's called a value match, I think it's fine if we want to try to at least, kind of like mimic the structure that we have in match. I'm fine with that. I guess one of the other open questions that I had is similar after listening to Eric's review. Do we want to call this, the reason why I called it the value match enumerator was mainly because that's exactly what it is. It's enumerated value matches. But would it be simpler if we just call it enumerator? I also wanted to kind of like differentiate between the already like existing class match collection, which is technically a match enumerator. So this kind of like connoted that this was a different thing. It was an actual value match enumerator. But I'm fine if we instead want to just call it enumerator.
I think not calling it just enumerator makes sense here.
Okay.
And you got to pick a name, picking the name of the thing that it enumerates, which if we call it value match, then value match enumerator, I think that makes sense.
Okay. Yeah, by the way, Steve, like the reason why we picked value match, well, why I picked value match was because after talking to Jeremy, he said, he suggested that usually like whenever we are trying to do a ref struct version of a type, of a reference type, whenever we don't find a better name for it, we just add value as a prefix. So that's why I went with this. And it's, of course, because eventually the goal is to try to support as much things as we can that you can do with a match. So, for example, captures.
So from that perspective, like the comparison between match and value match, there are other things that match exposes. Did you go through those and decide explicitly against things like
groups or?
I mean, I know you previously had the span on here, and you replaced it with range. Did you consider augmenting it with range and still having the span?
I didn't. I basically, after talking to Jeremy, I decided not to include span at all. We could have, for example, since you proposed having index and length, we could have index length and range, so that it also provides the easiness of just indexing that people that know how to use range are familiar with. So we could do that as well. We could augment it, and I don't think that would be kind of like a constraint of not using value match as the name of the type, because now we have other stuff that's not exactly matching what the match was. But I'm open to suggestions as well.
I don't have strong opinions. I just want to make sure we thought through. I mean, there's something to be said for keeping things simple and starting small and adding to it later. So it seems reasonable as long as we thought about it. Scrolling down to your if and when we later want to do matches or captures, here's how we would do it part at the bottom.
It's all the way to the bottom.
This would necessitate adding 4 new overloads.
Yeah. Yeah, so we could, like, if we're finalized with this form, we could just have that include captures option. But actually, like, we could propose like this API from to begin with, basically. So we could have that so this is just if you decide to call to that you want captures, then you would call enumerate, pass in this bool set to true, and then what you would be basically what this would cause is that now we would allocate, because in order to include the captures in a thread safe way, we will need to allocate a match object. So this is just Stephen's suggestion after looking at my initial prototype was, well, maybe that value match should just contain a nullable match object, a property that is returned back, and that one has the capture information that you want.
To be clear, this was my off the cuff, like maybe we could consider this. I don't know that it's fully feasible. It wouldn't just be allocating the match and its supporting data structures because the match object can't store the span, we would have to proactively create every string that someone could possibly want from it, which would mean every capture's capture.
Well, you could at the time when we're creating the value match struct, we could pass in the original read-only span and the actual match, and then when we're building this match object, we could call the toString in there, which would now then have that would basically cause it so that all of the groups captures and all of that, those will have the right value.
That's what I mean. The moment you access value match.match, we would have to proactively populate the whole object.
Right.
Even for things that you might never ask for.
Correct.
Yeah.
Yeah. I do have an alternative design that isn't basically going to cost allocations, but as Stephen pointed out in that prototype, it has some other problems where it's using an underlying match object that's an internal field inside of the regex object, and that has problems because that could get modified while you're trying to access it. And so even though that would be a way to get the captures allocation free, it might cause problems if you're trying to use the same regex object in a different thread or something.
I think the most important thing for right now is we need to be confident that the base thing that we're adding as part of just giving back the index and length is capable of growing up into something that can support captures in one way, shape, or form. And as long as we're comfortable that there's some design that we could support it, I'm happy with it. What I want to avoid is adding this now and then just after we ship 7 realizing, oh, we should have done it entirely differently to support captures. So I just think as part of shipping 7, we need to do enough. If we don't go all the way and just add capture support, I think we need to do enough to prove to ourselves that this thing that we're adding now, which looks fine, can be augmented.
And I assume, based on the discussion that we had earlier, Joe, that the value match, you are still holding the reference to this span, which is why this is still a ref struct, and that's so that you can or do have the option of growing it later.
Not that value match. So that one actually could now, instead of being a ref struct, it could only be a read-only struct. That one today only has the range and only will have eventually probably like a match object inside of it. But it doesn't need to hold the read-only span. The one that needs to hold the read-only span for sure is the match enumerator. So that one needs to stay a ref struct. But the thing that's returned back could theoretically be a read-only struct.
Yeah, just going along with the feedback that I was just giving, we need to be very sure that we will never need that to store the span.
Because you can't add ref later.
Yeah.
Is it a breaking change to remove ref?
I don't think so. Because everywhere you could have used it will still compile. The runtime shouldn't care. Because compile time, it just is whether or not it can be captured or otherwise boxed.
Boxed, yeah.
In the so because adding it later, you would get an invalid program exception because the runtime will prevent you from moving it to the heap. But if it was declared ref and by the time the runtime sees it, it's not. The runtime doesn't care.
I think that's right. So I think we should keep it as ref until we prove to ourselves in the next few months that
don't need those.
We won't need it for supporting captures, and then we can remove it.
Okay, that sounds good to me. And sorry.
I was gonna say, I think my guess is just the index and length will buy us a lot, and it is possible for someone to, once they have the index, they could rerun the match with a start at of that index. It'd be more expensive, but they could use that as a way to get the captures. Although that also makes the assumption that they have a string, because you can only call match if you have a string. But it's not completely blocking off captures by not having it. I do think, though, that there's probably a large number of scenarios that are going to require captures, and we'll probably need to do some more digging there.
And just to your earlier point, Steve, I don't think that this is going to block us from eventually supporting captures. The design that's like this. The downside that I do see is what you just said, which is, well, what you said earlier, which is probably it might require having additional, like 3 more overloads that only take in an extra bool or something to include captures, or an extra method instead that just always has captures. So like enumerate matches with captures or something like that. Okay, and so the suggestion is to have both in index length and range.
Well,
right?
so I was going to ask. You'd mentioned it, and that we could easily just put it on there. Index and length. I checked, and the match, which inherits group, which inherits capture. Anyway, whatever thing.
Yeah,
Index and
it's-
length are the
it's a-
names of the properties that are exposed. Even though
Yeah.
I don't remember if in span and memory we call them index or offset, but so index and length match the current types, and we could add range as convenience, or if we don't think people need it yet, then we can remove it. But I was just saying it can be done without even changing the size of the struct. It's because it's just syntax.
One other thing to consider, Jose, when you're actually going and looking and doing this is, by and large, the backtracking engines, capture support is relatively cheap. In the non-backtracking engine, capture support is pretty expensive. And so you might look as if someone uses, just like with ismatch, we set that quick flag to true and we skip a whole bunch of expense. You might look at augmenting that to pass an additional thing saying we actually need the actual index and length, but we don't need captures, and that should make the non-backtracking engine implementing this cheaper.
Okay. Yeah, makes sense.
So does
That
anybody?
wouldn't really change this API shape, bro, right?
No, that would have zero impact, but it speaks to the fact that being able to differentiate at the time the operation is being performed, whether captures are desired or not, is valuable.
Yeah.
And then, even though it's annoying to somebody who receives the Boolean of an option as a Boolean, the notion that you wanted them to be parallel methods instead of parameters would impact your ability to even trim out all of your capture support. But
yeah.
Maybe. I don't know if the trimmer can see enough of your internals, but that theoretically, if people only called the simple one, you might not even need capture support in the trimmed engine. So does anybody want to keep or remove a range accelerator property? Or name it, or anything?
I'm fine with either or. Don't really have a preference.
So after you and I talked this morning, Joe, when you rewrote things as using the range syntax here, if the range syntax weren't here and you had to use index and length, do you believe that you would find that more or less cumbersome, or I guess just differently cumbersome? Like having written it with the range syntax, would you be sad to see it go?
No, I think I would just call slice and that's fine. In fact,
here you would have just done span of index to ask if it was A instead of a span of range of 0. So
yeah. I mean, but I'm not I'm a novice user of ranges, so I haven't used them extensively. So I don't
Sure.
know if my feedback is.
But I mean, as I showed here, this it's super easy to add later. So
Yeah.
less is more. No one called for it. I'll delete it.
Okay. Sounds good to me.
Okay. So here at the bottom, there's nothing from chat, or chat froze when OBS. I don't even actually even know if the stream's still running. I hope it is. OBS at some point stopped painting, and then it recovered. So if chat's dead, I apologize, but if it's dead, you can't hear me. So yeah, cool. All right. We jump into index. Just writing it twice because why not? All right. So new ref struct value match has index and length. 4 enumerate matches methods. They all take Rosh char. Input, I assume, is the name of the parameter we currently take. So this is pattern matching. They're already being painted with string syntax, so Steve doesn't have to rerun all of his magic juju to figure out where they should go. And we have a struct enumerator type. We like it having a custom name, and it put the read-onlys in the right place that made me go fix Tarek's proposal. I think this covers the scenario.
This is totally minor, and we can fix it in PR. But Jose, the second and third enumerate matches, the string syntax argument should be taking options as the additional parameter.
Right. Yep. Sorry about that. We'll fix.
Isn't that the... No, I got it with URI kind. It's like I feel that was the one useful piece of input I had in the code review for that.
I appreciate it.
I assume the timeout wouldn't affect the syntax highlighter. So, okay, so I fixed the string syntax attribute, or broke it, one of the two. All right, any other feedback?
Thank you very much, and Steve, sorry for hijacking.
No, you're good.
We're gonna talk about
This is more important.
All right. Well, we almost got through all the reds that we were capable of talking through today. In fact, I guess we did get through all the reds we were capable of talking to today. We almost got to a non-red item. Instead, that will wait for next week if we're lucky.
At which point there will be 17 more red items. So
yeah. So yes, I don't know if the API. I guess I can look if the calendar data feed problem has gotten fixed. No. So eventually, for people who don't have this just in Outlook already, the calendar here will get fixed. Emo, who just dropped conveniently. But yeah, so we're probably doing 2 a week for a while until we get caught back to normal. And yeah, with that, I observe we are over time, and I would like to eat lunch. So I declare this meeting adjourned. Have a good afternoon or evening, everybody. Me too. It's great.